Yeah, I would say if we think about one last point I wanted to touch on that he covered was that when we look at the world, we don't see design. I think that for us, the doctrine of the fall is very important, and the Orthodox doctrine of the fall is different than the Roman Catholic doctrine. There's some nuances that are important. One thing that we stress, along with Romans 8 of Paul, is that the fall affected the entire cosmos. And so all of reality is subject to decay, bondage, corruption, as Paul says in Romans 8, because of man being put in a position of stewardship. And then when he fell, that affected all of reality. So the fall is much more cosmic and metaphysical in scope for us. And therefore, when we think about the result of the fall, one thing it does for us in our theology, as St. Maxima pointed out, is that it puts things into tension that aren't necessarily inherently in tension. After the fall, we see things in tension. We see a predator-prey relationship introduced into nature that's not, strictly speaking, natural. It's actually unnatural. Death for us is unnatural. Death is the enemy, Paul says, and God has allowed it to be, permitted it. We believe in what St. John of Damascus calls God's permissive will, which is different than his pure omniscient foreknowledge. So he does permit things. We accept that on the basis of revelation. We can't give you all the exact reasons as to why, because first of all, we're finite. No worldview, no position can give you all the explanations and answers for all of those problems. It's actually impossible. So to ask that or even to expect that of any worldview is really an impossible task, and I don't think really even much of an argument at all. So I would say that all beliefs, all religions, all churches, all sects, all groups, they all have some dogma, even if the dogma is that they're total relativists and subjectivists. I'm not saying you are, but even if they are, there still is a dogma that you have to be a relativist, right? So I couldn't come into a relativist meeting, like a college class, something like that, all right? A secular college philosophy class. I had many of those. And I was the one guy who wasn't a relativist. I wasn't welcome there. They didn't like me there because you have to believe in relativism to be in that class, right? So even relativism is dogmatic. And so there's no position that can be, again, perfectly neutral. So he said that the majority of the church fathers didn't believe in orthodoxy, maybe during one period of the Arian crisis. Otherwise, I don't think that's correct. But again, our theology isn't necessarily always determined by the majority. So that really had no point. There's nothing. I see no relevance in that point. He mentioned Jesus's teaching in the broadest sense. I mean, if we accept Jesus' teaching, Jesus said, you accept all of it, right? If you love him, you'll keep his commandments. There's no shortening it, cutting off and boiling it down to, something where it's just this. Unless you want to say that, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and keep the commandments, right? The law. Jesus says that is what sums up the entire Mosaic law. Jesus says that following him is the keeping of all of the law, and all the law, the 10 commandments, are summed up in love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That means that Jesus is teaching the same thing as the Old Testament. Jesus is who gave the 10 commandments in our view. So he said Christians don't agree. So what? Gnostics don't agree. That's not an argument. He says that Gnostics were praised by their enemies. Perhaps he's right about the Middle Ages when he talks about the Cathars. Malcolm Lambert has a big 600-page book that's really good on the Cathars, by the way. It's called Medieval Heresy. I do recommend that book. But when it comes to the early church, no, they were not praised, especially not by Irenaeus or any of the other church fathers, Tertullian, who did write against the Gnostics at length. Perhaps Origen was Gnostic and was praised. Yeah, he influenced the Cappadocians. But regardless, he's later rejected by the time of the Sixth Council explicitly. Gnostics were pacifists, perhaps, he seemed to say. I'm not convinced of that. Maybe some of the Gnostics were, but again, this assumes that there's a kind of singular body of Gnostics. He admits that much of the Gnostic writings were lost, and so now it's been restored? I don't know. I'm not sure. I believe that the modern restoration of Gnosticism is legitimate. The Gnostics, I don't think, agreed amongst themselves. He mentioned no coherent moral theology from orthodoxy. I would totally disagree. We have what's called canon law, for example. Most of the canonical Orthodox churches in the world will believe in something like canon law. This is a great heritage that's been handed down. The idea of canon law influenced modern law theory, whether it's Eastern canon law or Western canon law. Modern jurisprudence is irrevocably influenced by canon law. The rights of the accusers, of the accused, that's actually from church canon law. Civil canon law in the history of the West and the East didn't tend to do that. It was the church that tempered the state and gave the individual the right to have a fair trial and to have rights as accused. That's all from church canon law. And these are well-known developments in the history of the West. We founded science. Science comes out of medieval universities. This may be totally lost on modern people, but no, actually modern science comes out of universities. Guess where universities come from? Byzantium. What is the theology of Byzantium? Orthodoxy. The longest running empire, the most successful economic empire in the history of the world was Orthodox. It was Byzantium. So we give universities, we give civilization, all of these things come from the treasures of Orthodoxy. So I would say that we can prove that our morals, our theology is from God. I'm not saying that just because of history it proves it. I was just rebutting certain points that he made about history. We've actually built civilizations. Canon law is very important in the history of law. The history of law theory, universities come from Orthodoxy. So when we reject dialectics and dialectical tensions and the presuppositions of dialectics, which are the very root of all Gnostic systems, are all built on dialectical tensions and the assumptions of dialectics, all the way back to Plato. When we reject that, what we're left with is a unique revealed anthropology and a unique metaphysic, a unique worldview, a unique ethic that is not just in theory, it's actually been proved and stamped into history in the longest empire in the world.
All right. Thank you, Jay. Scott, closing statements, please.
So I've enjoyed this discussion, and I'm shocked that Jay and I cannot resolve all our differences in an hour and 40 minutes. Who knew that Christians could disagree on one or two things?